In order to understand the significance of the new broker and trust model in the industry, I think it's really important to take a few minutes to just take a look at the overall value a broker can have to any consumer. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about is strategy. The one thing that's very important that everybody understands that are professionals in this industry is that buying and selling a house isn't the goal. When people are buying or call on a real estate professional, they're trying to accomplish a whole series of goals.
It's not about buying and selling per se. It's about everything else that's wrapped up in a real estate transaction.
Do you want to live in the house for 5 years? Are you going to bring your family up here? Are schools important to you? Are you traveling for work?
The first thing that I need to do when interacting with a client is to find out what is their goal, what are their needs, what is their timetable, and how can I best serve that and help them accomplish their goal.
If you don't sit down and strategize with the client up front, you're not going to know where you're going through the transaction.
And to really talk to somebody to find out the emotion that goes along with the decision that they're making.
My experience really looked at those people's needs and found out what they wanted and did exactly what they needed to happen to get them moved from that house to a house closer to the kids' school. So I don't know, could you put a dollar figure on that? I don't think you can. I mean, that's really seeing someone's need, really caring, and really pulling out the resources to make that happen. So I don't think an inexperienced person could do that.
That sixth sense is something that you develop with time and expertise. Because if I had known at the beginning what I would need to know, it could almost be overwhelming because it's a huge volume of learning that takes place over 35 years.
A broker's sensitivity to all those issues is very, very important in creating a proper strategy on how to approach either buying a house or getting your property sold. The next component to broker value has to do with the actual process of matching buyers and sellers together, finding a home for a buyer or finding a buyer for a home. And that's an important process, important part of the process, but it's not the only part of the process.
One of the misconceptions I've noticed with buyers today, they think that the most important job that I have is to find them a house, open the door, let them in to see it. Whether they found it on the internet or they drove by and called me on one of my signs, or I found the house and introduced them to it. But that plays such a small part in the buying and selling process. I don't even think it amounts to 20% of the total value that a good broker can bring to your transaction.
A lot of people think that finding a home for a buyer or finding a buyer for a home is the most important thing in a real estate transaction. And while it's important, it is not near the most important thing in a transaction.
Searches start online now more than 85% of the time. People feel like the only part of the real estate transaction is actually finding the house because that is something they can do. Back when I started, it was a book that came out every Friday. So a consumer had no way to get that information unless they drove a neighborhood and saw a for sale sign. So today, because the internet is so rich with all that information, I think that buyers and sellers think that that's really the only way to find a house, and really that's not the most important part of the transaction.
You have to be concerned about how you market a piece of property, and you have to have creative energy spent on how to locate properties for buyers, and good professional people will have a good plan to do that. And it's one of the important components to selecting a broker and evaluating who should work for you. The next component, maybe the most valuable component to a broker's value, is negotiating. Once a buyer and seller have been brought together, now the serious work begins. Contracts are written, and then dialogue between the brokers and the clients start to take place. And a serious, committed real estate professional at this stage of the transaction can have a tremendous financial impact on a transaction.
While finding a home for a buyer is important, while strategizing for goals are important, I believe that the most important part of a transaction and the biggest value that a broker brings to a transaction is negotiations.
We know that we're not making the transaction. We are only negotiators. The buyer and the seller are making the transactions. We don't get to make the decisions for them. We just get to point out solutions and point out problems and help them through them. So unequivocally, negotiating to me is a prime area, and it encompasses so much. It's so much bigger than just the word negotiating, what that means in a transaction.
How am I able to tell when the agent on the other side of the transaction is lacking in experience? It usually starts with the purchase agreement, how they've written it, whether they've protected their client, whether it be a buyer or a seller. And I can see from the transaction, they haven't asked for something that they should have. It's not my job to write their contract for them, so I'm dealing it from the perspective of the client I'm representing. And I will actually tell my seller, if, for example, a buyer's agent has checked a box asking for a termite inspection, but hasn't made any provision for what if something's found. They haven't asked for who's going to be responsible for taking care of repairs. So I'll counsel my seller and say, look, this offer's been written in this manner. We may have a problem later on.
When I was a manager with 150 plus agents in my office, in those days, there was no way to keep track of all those people. There was no way to know how each individual person was conducting their business. I had assistant manager, I had someone else that could read some of the transactions, but you just couldn't be on top of how everyone did their business. You could not know what was being said in the name of the company and how they were handling it, and if it was reputable, and if it was accurate, and if it was in the client's best interest.
When I'm either making an offer on a property or receiving an offer on a listing, I always Google the other agent first and find out all about them. And if that agent isn't experienced, I say to everybody, I'm going to have my way with them, and usually do. And we end up basically getting way more than really should be. Sometimes I actually feel bad because it's like a no-brainer. I mean, that experience, in a negotiation, the way to talk to the person, the how to talk to the person, knowing so much information, it's almost an unfair advantage, actually.
My negotiating technique is also going to be based on the experience level of the other side.
My skills at negotiating can virtually make the difference in whether or not a client gets his house sold or my buyer gets the house he wants to buy.
The significance of that negotiating stage and all the dialogue and the negotiations that starts after that contract is written becomes a very, very important place in the process where a lot of dollars can be made or lost. And there's no substitute for transactional experience. A broker who has 100 or 200 or 300 negotiations in their past is just absolutely more qualified to go to that negotiation in representation of a client.
Part of the transaction puzzle, if you will, is vetting vendors. And by that I mean you have an escrow officer, you have a mortgage person, you have a title person, you have somebody that's helping you with home inspection and things of that nature. These are all your partners in a transaction. And by choosing the right ones, depending on the transaction, if it's vacant land, if it's a large home in a gated community, if there's homeowners associations involved and things of this nature, by knowing players in the industry that understand how to work as a team, the vetting of the vendors is an important part of the transaction as a whole.
This is a relationship business. So in the only way you gain relationships is over time. It goes back to experience and it goes back to transactions. So if you don't have the transactions, then you're not going to have enough experience to help vet appropriate vendors for any given real estate transaction.
Yeah, selecting the right vendors for the transaction can make or break your deal. And probably one of the right now in our industry, the mortgage is probably the most important thing. So I actually am to a point now with my buyers, if they're not going to deal with a direct lender and someone that will answer their phone when we call, doesn't mean I have to know them, I just need to be able to interview them before we get into the transaction, then I'm not going to do the transaction because 90% of the time it's not going to close anyways.
Past experience is a good indicator of future value on a vendor. And has that vendor stepped up to the plate when we maybe need something done more quickly? Or are they looking out for their client in the best way too? And because a vendor can be more than just a termite company or a home inspector.
The next component to a value a broker can have to a consumer has to do with the process during escrow. And this is a really dynamic process nowadays. There's so many changes, particularly in the lending side of the business today, that all sorts of things seem to come up that no one has ever seen before. And so a person's instinct in these transactions can make a significant difference to a client today.
Escrow, of course, is the period after a contract is signed and before the title changes. Again, we're negotiating during that period, but we're problem solving, we're handling legal issues, we're helping a buyer get a loan, we're helping a seller move.
I think a lot of times that people who aren't experienced in this business, agents, tend to be reactionary and don't look for what do we want the end result to be. So they're just reacting and not actually thinking about how to get from this point to this point. Because there is a way to do it, and there's a way to get it done and get it closed and be win-win for everybody. But without experience, I don't think you can make those decisions.
Entering escrow after buyer and seller have agreed on the price is just the beginning. We start doing inspections, we gather reports from homeowners associations if it happens to be a gated community or a condominium complex. Title reports come in, inspectors find things. That's where the fun begins. That's where the negotiation happens. And that's where knowledge is so very important.
Every item that comes up in question or every direction that needs to be pursued one way or another can have an impact on whether or not it's going to close and whether or not it should close.
If there's a problem with the transaction, which there will be a problem with the transaction, it's how big the problem is and how many there are. As a experienced broker, you can pull from your knowledge and be able to handle those objections and those situations to be able to help your client to come out with the most value possible.
Things can fall apart at that last moment, and my greatest job and responsibility is to make sure that never happens on my transactions.
Even after the close of escrow, you need a broker who is there for you. That's the sixth and final component of broker value.
There are things that come up after the close of escrow, and you have to be present. You have to be there for them. They expect you to be there for them, and that's just part of it.
And today's transactions can be protracted. I mean, I deal with a lot of trust attorneys, clients who didn't anticipate that they really should have put all their things in a trust. And so instead it's a probate, and people don't realize that can go on for years. So my relationship with clients lasts for a long amount of time.
A transaction is finished to a degree once the escrow closes and the keys are handed over to the buyer, or so people think. There are things that happen after the close of escrow that are extremely important to make sure that the buyer or seller are well taken care of, because people get upset and all of a sudden a lawsuit appears.
I'm in the service business. So my service business goes on regardless of the marketplace.
I am my client's real estate professional for life.